The dust tasted of absence. Thomas felt it coat his tongue every morning when he woke, the same fine grit that settled on his late wife's rocking chair and on the silent toys in his daughter's room. For a year, the ranch house had been a study in quiet decay, a place where grief was the only thing that grew. He could handle the cattle, mend the fences, and face down a winter storm, but he could not conjure life back into the cold hearth of his kitchen. He needed a baker, someone to fight back the silence with the simple scent of bread. But as he watched the wagon approach, carrying the woman who had answered his advertisement, he knew he was asking for more than just baking. He was asking for a miracle. The woman who stepped down from the wagon was not what he'd expected. She was small, fine-boned, and moved with a careful grace that seemed out of place in the harsh Montana sunlight. She wore a prairie dress of dark, worn red, the color of a fading sunset. Her black hair was coiled in a neat bun, and her eyes, when she finally lifted them to his, were dark and deep and held a sorrow he recognized. His 7-year-old daughter, Sarah, who had followed him onto the porch, pressed herself against his leg, a phantom weight he was always aware of. She had not spoken a word since her mother's passing, her voice buried under a stone of grief too heavy for a child to move. The woman, An Lee, gave a small, respectful bow of her head. "Mr. Croft, I have come about the position." Her voice was soft, with a lilting cadence that was foreign and yet soothing. Thomas just nodded, his own voice a rusty thing in his throat. "The kitchen's through here." He led her inside, the screen door groaning shut behind them, sealing the three of them into the suffocating quiet of his life. An Lee's gaze swept over the room, taking in the layer of dust, the cold stove, the forlorn-looking flour sacks. She didn't flinch. Instead, she untied the strings of her bonnet, her movements deliberate and calm. Sarah's grip on his trousers tightened. Thomas felt a familiar pang of despair. This was a mistake. How could this stranger possibly understand the landscape of their loss? She was just a woman looking for work. But what he did not yet know was that An Lee understood loss better than most, and she had come seeking not just work, but a place where her own ghosts might finally rest. The first day, An Lee spoke little. She moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. She cleaned the stove until the iron gleamed, washed the windows until the summer light poured in unhindered, and sorted the pantry with methodical care. Thomas watched her from a distance while he mended a harness on the porch, the rhythmic scrape of his knife the only sound he contributed. Sarah sat on the top step, a little sentinel of silence, her eyes fixed on the open kitchen door. An Lee never once tried to speak to the girl. She seemed to understand that Sarah was a creature to be approached with the same caution as a fawn in the woods. Instead, she began to bake. She worked the dough on a floured board, her hands moving with a sureness that was mesmerizing. Soon, a scent began to fill the house, a warm, yeasty aroma that Thomas hadn't smelled in over a year. It was the scent of life, of sustenance, of home. It wrapped around the silence and seemed to soften its sharp edges. When the loaves came out of the oven, golden brown and perfect, An Lee placed one on a cutting board to cool. She glanced toward the porch, her eyes meeting Thomas's for a brief second before she looked away. A while later, Thomas saw her place a small, perfectly round roll, still warm from the oven, on the corner of the kitchen table nearest the door. She then turned her back, busying herself with another task. After a long time, Sarah slipped off the porch step and crept into the house. Thomas held his breath. He saw his daughter's small hand reach out, hesitate, and then snatch the roll. She scurried back to her spot on the porch, cradling the bread as if it were a precious treasure. She didn't eat it right away. She just held it, feeling its warmth, breathing in its scent. It was the first offering of kindness she had accepted from anyone but him since the world went quiet. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest, a feeling so close to hope it was painful. This arrangement was more than a transaction of wages for bread. It was a fragile truce with the emptiness that had claimed his home. The days settled into a new rhythm, measured by the rising and baking of bread. An Li's presence was a quiet hum in the background of the ranch's hard-edged life. She asked for nothing, but slowly she began to reclaim the house from its sorrow. She planted a small herb garden by the kitchen window and mended the curtains with tiny, invisible stitches. Her dark red dress became a familiar spot of color against the endless brown and green of the landscape. Sarah, drawn by the irresistible gravity of the warm kitchen, began to spend her time inside, sitting on a stool in the corner, watching An Li work. She was still silent, but her eyes were alive with curiosity. One afternoon, An Li was kneading a large batch of dough for sweet rolls. Without looking up, she broke off a small piece and placed it on a flowered section of the table near Sarah's stool. She made no gesture, said no word. She simply left it there, an invitation without pressure. For nearly an hour, Sarah just looked at it. Then, her small fingers reached out and poked the soft dough. She began to mimic An Li's movements, pushing and folding the little lump with intense concentration. A faint dusting of flour settled on her nose. From the doorway, Thomas watched, his heart aching with a strange mix of joy and sorrow. He was seeing a ghost of the daughter he used to know. That evening, a man on a fine horse rode up to the fence line. He was dressed in a clean city suit that looked ridiculous against the rugged backdrop. This was Mr. Harrison, the railroad man who had been buying up surrounding properties with a blend of charm and coercion. "Croft," he called out, his voice smooth and confident. "Still holding out, I see. My offer for your water rights still stands. It's more than generous." Thomas walked to the fence, his posture stiff. "It's not for sale, Harrison." Harrison's smile was thin. "Everything is for sale, my friend. It's just a matter of finding the right price, or the right motivation." His eyes flickered toward the house where the lamp had just been lit, and Thomas saw him notice the two silhouettes inside, one woman, one child. A cold dread washed over him. The stakes were no longer just about land and water. They were about the fragile peace being baked into the heart of his home. The pressure from Harrison began to build, like a summer storm gathering on the horizon. His men were seen more often, riding the perimeter of Thomas's land, their presence a silent, constant threat. The work on the ranch grew harder, as if the land itself could feel the tension. One evening, as An Li was clearing the supper dishes, her sleeve rode up, revealing a pale, jagged scar on the inside of her wrist. Thomas noticed it, a white line against her skin. He said nothing, but the image stayed with him. A few nights later, a coyote was spooked from the brush near the house, and its panic cry sent Sarah into a fit of trembling. An Li was there before Thomas could even move, kneeling beside the girl, not touching her, but humming a low, soothing melody. The tune was foreign, ancient, and it seemed to calm the very air in the room. Sarah's shaking subsided, and she leaned ever so slightly toward the sound. Later, after Sarah was asleep, Thomas found An Li on the porch, looking out at the vast, star-dusted sky. "That song," he said, his voice quiet. "I've not heard one like it." An Li didn't turn. "It is from my home, a song for calming spirits." They stood in silence for a moment before Thomas found the courage to ask, "Your husband, you never speak of him." An Li's hands tightened in her lap. "He was a good man," she whispered. "He built a life for us from nothing, a small laundry in a mining town. But men like your Mr. Harrison, they wanted the land our shop was on. They said it belonged to the railroad. They offered him pennies. When he refused, there was a fire." She finally turned to look at him, and in the moonlight he could see the unshed tears glistening in her eyes. "The scar is from a falling beam. It is all I have left of that life." The revelation landed between them, heavy and profound. They were not so different. Both had lost everything to a world that took without asking. His grief was from God's hand, hers was from man's, but the shape of the emptiness it left behind was the same. His protective instinct, long dormant, flared to life. This wasn't just about his ranch anymore. It was about defending this quiet, strong woman who had brought the scent of hope back into his home. The shadow of the villain had grown long enough to touch them both. The summer heat intensified, baking the land and making the air thick and heavy. A storm had been threatening for days, the clouds building into a bruised purple mass over the mountains. When it finally broke, it was with a terrifying violence. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder cracked the sky open, each clap like a cannon shot. Thomas was securing the barn door when the first real boom shook the ground. His dog Scout whined and pressed against his leg. His first thought was of Sarah. He ran back to the house, bursting through the door to find a scene that stopped him cold. Sarah was not hiding under her bed or frozen in a corner as she usually was during storms. She was pressed against An Lee, her small hands clutching the folds of the dark red dress, her face buried in An Lee's side. An Lee was sitting on the floor with her, one arm wrapped securely around the child's trembling shoulders, humming that same low, calming tune. She didn't flinch at the thunder. Her presence was an anchor in the storm, for both the child and the man watching from the doorway. Thomas stood there, soaked and silent, feeling a profound shift inside him. He was not just her employer, and she was not just his baker. In the heart of the storm, in the small circle of lamplight, they looked like a family. The yearning he felt was so powerful it was a physical ache in his chest. He wanted this. He wanted this quiet strength, this gentle courage to be a permanent fixture in their lives. The storm raged outside, but inside the small ranch house, a fragile peace had taken root. This was the quiet before what came next, a moment of shelter before the real tempest arrived. He knew Harrison wouldn't give up, and the thought of losing this, of having this sanctuary shattered, filled him with a cold, protective fury he hadn't felt in years. He would not let that happen. The storm passed, leaving the air washed clean and the ground soft, but the peace it left behind was short-lived. The next morning, Thomas rode out to check on the northern pasture and found what he had been dreading. A section of his fence was cut, and a slow-burning fire had been set in the tall, dry grass. It wasn't meant to destroy the ranch, not yet. It was a message, written in smoke and ash. It was Harrison, turning up the heat. He raced back to the house, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and fear. "An Lee!" he yelled, his voice raw. "There's a fire in the north pasture! Get the water barrels on the wagon!" She didn't panic or ask questions. She simply nodded, her face grim, and moved with swift purpose. While Thomas hitched his steadiest horse, Dusty, to the wagon, she filled every bucket and barrel they had, her movements economical and strong. Even Sarah seemed to understand the urgency. She ran back and forth, bringing wet burlap sacks from the shed, her small face set with determination. They worked together, a small, desperate team against the encroaching threat. Out at the pasture, the fire was spreading faster than he'd feared. The air was thick with acrid smoke that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Thomas fought the flames with a shovel, digging a fire break in the scorched earth, his muscles screaming with effort. An Lee was right beside him, beating at the edges of the fire with a wet sack, her red dress now streaked with soot and grime. She worked with a ferocity that matched his own, her slight frame belying an incredible strength. They moved in a rhythm born of shared purpose, their breaths ragged, their faces grim. They were no longer a man who had hired a woman to bake. They were partners, fighting for the same patch of ground, for the same fragile future. As the sun began to set, they finally brought the last of the flames under control, leaving a great black scar on the land. Exhausted and filthy, they stood side by side, watching the last wisps of smoke curl into the twilight sky. The external threat was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was here, and it had tasted their land. Thomas looked at An-Li, at her soot-stained face and the fierce light in her eyes, and knew he would die before he let Harrison take anything more from them. They were still cleaning up from the fire 2 days later when 3 riders appeared on the ridge. It was Harrison, flanked by 2 hired guns. They didn't stop at the fence this time. They rode straight into the yard, their horses trampling An-Li's small herb garden. Thomas put himself between them and the porch, where An-Li had instinctively pulled Sarah behind her. "Get off my land, Harrison," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. Harrison dismounted, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "I'm done being neighborly, Croft. You're going to sign this deed. Today." He smirked, his gaze sliding past Thomas to An-Li. "Or perhaps your new housekeeper can persuade you." Before Thomas could react, one of the men spurred his horse forward, leaning down to grab An-Li by the arm. She cried out, a sharp sound of pain and surprise. Scout, the dog, launched himself at the horse, barking furiously, but the man kicked him away. He dragged An-Li forward, her feet stumbling in the dust. Sarah, who had been hidden behind An-Li's skirts, was suddenly exposed, standing alone and terrified. Harrison's cold eyes landed on her. A pretty little girl. Be a shame if she had to watch her father be so stubborn. He took a step toward Sarah. The world seemed to slow down. Thomas saw the terror in his daughter's wide eyes. He saw the defiant fear on An-Li's face as she struggled against the man's grip. He saw the smug cruelty in Harrison's expression. A year of silence, a year of grief and loss and emptiness, coalesced into a single, unbearable moment. And then, a sound tore through the heavy air. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a man's shout. It was a small, clear voice, rusty from disuse but filled with a child's pure rage. "No!" Sarah screamed the word. It was a cannonball of sound, shattering the stillness. "Leave her alone!" The word, that impossible sound from a silent child, struck everyone dumb. Harrison froze, his mouth slightly agape, his confident swagger gone. The man holding An-Li loosened his grip in sheer shock. For a full second, the only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn. In that moment of stunned silence, Harrison took an involuntary step backward, his heel catching on the uneven edge of the porch steps he'd been standing beside. He stumbled, flailing for balance, his hand reaching out for something that wasn't there. What was there, coiled in the sliver of shade beneath the bottom step, was a prairie rattlesnake, disturbed by the commotion and the sudden movement. With a dry, buzzing hiss, it struck, its fangs sinking deep into Harrison's calf. He let out a strangled cry of agony and disbelief, collapsing to the ground and clutching his leg. The sudden, violent turn of events broke the spell. The hired gun holding An-Li, seeing his employer down and the situation spiraling, shoved her away and spurred his horse, galloping out of the yard without a backward glance. The other man, unnerved by the snake and his boss's screams, quickly followed suit. Nature, the very land Harrison had sought to conquer and control, had delivered its own brutal judgment. Thomas didn't hesitate. He lunged for the rifle he kept mounted by the door as An-Li scrambled to Sarah, pulling the child into her arms. Sarah was trembling, but she was clinging to An-Li, her face buried in the woman's shoulder, her small fists still clenched. Thomas stood over Harrison, whose face was already turning a ghastly shade of gray. There was nothing he could do. The venom was swift, the justice of the frontier absolute. He turned away from the dying man and went to his family. He knelt in the dust, wrapping his arms around both An-Lee and Sarah, pulling them into a tight, protective embrace. He could feel Sarah's small body shaking with sobs, but for the first time in a year, they were sobs that had a voice. He buried his face in his daughter's hair, his own eyes burning. The silence was broken. The siege was over. Months passed. The scorched patch on the north pasture began to sprout new grass. The summer heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Mr. Harrison was buried in an unmarked grave, his ambition consumed by the very dirt he'd tried to steal. The railroad found another route, and a quiet peace settled over the Croft Ranch. The house was no longer a place of absence. It was filled with the constant, comforting scent of baking bread, cinnamon, and roasting herbs. It smelled of home. Sarah's voice, once unearthed, was a cautious but steady presence. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words were clear and true. She spent her afternoons in the kitchen with An-Lee, a dusting of flour always on her cheek, her laughter a sound Thomas had thought he would never hear again. One evening, as the sun bled crimson and gold across the western sky, Thomas stood on the porch, watching his daughter chase butterflies near the barn. An-Lee came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron. They stood in comfortable silence, a habit they had perfected. The dark red dress she had arrived in was worn and faded now, but to him it was the most beautiful color in the world. "She's happy," An-Lee said softly, her eyes on Sarah. "We're happy," Thomas corrected her, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused from work but fit perfectly in his. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of deep, abiding gratitude and a quiet promise. It was the culmination of a slow burn, a bond forged in shared loss and rebuilt in the warmth of a kitchen hearth. An-Lee's fingers curled around his, her hand firm in his grasp. They had survived. Together, they had taken a house haunted by ghosts and filled it with life. The silence had been broken, not just by a child's first word, but by the steady, beating heart of a family, remade and whole. That story shows us that sometimes the thing we think we need, like a simple baker for a lonely ranch, is just the beginning of a journey to what our soul truly craves: connection, healing, and a place to call home. It's a testament to the quiet strength that can mend the most broken of things. If you were moved by their story of survival and love, please give this video a like. Share it with someone who appreciates a tale of the Old West where courage comes in many forms. And for more stories that explore the heart of the frontier, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Thomas and An-Lee's story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below.